Hello and welcome here again live to the World Crypto Network. It is the second day of the Hayek Summer Conference, and today we're joined by Ramon. Ramon, how are you?
Thank you, I'm great. Thanks for having me here.
Well, it's an honor to have you and to talk to you today, and I'm glad that you're joining us here in this conversation.
I'm glad as well. It's super interesting so far.
Right. So, of course, we are here at the Hayek Summer Workshop. Why did you come here? Why did you apply for this? And how do you like it so far?
Well, ever since I was back home in Venezuela, I had a strong leaning towards libertarian ideas, especially in the context in which you are suppressed virtually in every aspect of your life. So I had a strong connection with the works of Hayek, with the works of Mises, of the whole Austrian circle, basically. And I just couldn't let this chance of deepening knowledge about that aspect of economics pass. I just had to take it, and luckily enough, I was picked, and I'm super honored to be here.
Yeah. And I do think that most or all of these students that are here are really glad that they got picked in this program. And because all of these applied voluntarily, they really want to be here, and just like you, they want to get educated. So what have you learned so far in these 2 days?
Well, there are many things that you, let's say, have heard about or even studied yourself, but it's definitely very, very helpful. The formalization of the arguments, for lack of a better word. I would say that it familiarizes it more with someone who's coming from an mainstream economic background in terms of education, right? So it's very helpful to see like the graphics, the econometrics behind it, the sort of evidence presented in a way that is very formal-like, instead of just discussions and informal conversations that you have, not because of anything inherent to the movement, but because of the conditions in which you had to discuss back home, of course. So it's very, it makes it more legitimate, I guess, that would be the word, in the circles in which you move right now, when you study economics in any university.
Right, because the current state of all teachings in universities are Keynesian and mainstream economics, right? And having proper arguments that are fundamentally based in reason and that are applied to the real world. And as you said, backed by the real numbers, backed by the evidence, that is a big advantage, and it's really nice to have that.
Yeah, you're using their language to promote your ideas. So it makes them more palatable for them to take them in, which could be very confrontational when you say no, a priori logical constructions, and you don't need mathematization of it, which, okay, there's an argument for that, but when you have to gain the hearts and minds of people to promote your idea, then you have to make some concessions, and I think this is so far a very, very impressive way of doing so.
Yeah, I agree fundamentally with you, yes. So you mentioned earlier that you are a Venezuelan. And,
yes.
So you grew up and you were born in Venezuela?
Yes, I come from Caracas, the capital city.
Oh, okay. So just open question, what is the current state of Venezuela and how did you get there?
Well, I'm sure like if you guys follow the news, you have heard any kind of story possible in terms of how primitive a society can become. Like, usually what you hear and what it's more like spread is this idea, and you hear it a lot as a joke, but also as a shock that, oh, you cannot find toilet paper. Like, it's not even the food, it's like that is the most shocking aspect of it for many people that live abroad. But it's so much more than that. It's not only toilet paper, it's food, it's medicine, are things that people need to keep living, for lack of a better expression, and they are basically in such a primitive state of Hayekian, if you want, state of nature, that they die on the street or they kill each other. So you have a spike not only of lack of goods and services, but also of violence and hostilities between each other, and of course criminality that comes with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so why do you think is it that there are a lack of resources, a lack of goods and services? Why is it that there is not enough of this plentiful world that we live in?
And not only plentiful world, world, but country. We have usually that comes up together with the news. Like, how is it possible that a country with the largest oil reserves in the world is going through such hardships, especially in the region? Because you would argue, okay, Latin America in general is like that, but that is not true. Venezuela is, even for that context, we are extremely, extremely destroyed. Yeah. So how can I explain it? Like, it's very, I guess, it is relatively simple if you know how to identify the problem. And I would argue that it started in 1976. That is the year in which the government nationalized the oil industry. So we had this concession model, which used to work relatively well. In fact, Venezuela was one of the richest countries in the world in the 50s and 60s. But then this pressure, right? Because governments have their own agenda, of course, and if they perceive the opportunity of getting more economic power, they surely are going to look for it, especially if there is some sort of legitimate argument for the population at the time to do so. So what they did was nationalize the oil industry, and then suddenly they had control of the most important economic activity of the country. And with that came an economic power that eroded institutions more and more and more. It is very or it is exactly what Adam Smith called the improper state. You don't depend on taxes anymore, so you have more of a window of action for the government to pursue their interests, which is always to remain in power, of course. So for flash forward 20 years, 22 years, and then Chavez comes into the picture, and he wins the elections because he perceived there was a huge portion of the population who was at the margin of society. They were relatively poor, or highly relatively poor compared to the higher circles of society, and that creates a tension that he exploited, and he got the power. And he immediately had enough support as well to change the constitution. So you can imagine the political capital that was behind it and the discontent of the people because of the model that was getting more and more that was promoting inequality, not in the sense that you hear today, but like real concentration through artificial means, right? So what happens then? He gets into power and has such political capital that he not only changed the constitution, but he made himself owner of the other powers of the democracy, of the Republican aspects of it. You have the executive, of course, he controls because he's the president in a Latin American country, which we tend to be very personalistic and we gravitate towards strong leaders. But he also controlled the parliament, and he also controlled the judicial branch eventually. So 4 years after that, he gets a coup d'etat, but he comes on top because he was a military man, and he tried to take power through violence, so he knew how it worked. So he came back, and he had the perfect excuse to control now absolutely everything, the absolute most total control of not only the military, which he did because he fired and imprisoned people who tried to take the power from him through force, which is a legitimate argument, you could argue, but still he took advantage of it, and then he fired more than half the employees of PDVSA, which is our oil company, and he put the people he wanted there. And from there on, he used the oil money to give subsidies, to give direct transfers to the people. And that, of course, creates a lot of political capital when people are disenfranchised at the margin of society. They suddenly feel included. But here's the thing, that is a fiscal policy that centers directly in the fact of concentrating every cent that enters into your economy to current expenditure. You're not investing, you're just giving the money for an immediate gain that doesn't have a return in the future. So the problem is that money was dependent on the high commodity prices that you saw in international markets. So it was a ticking bomb, which exploded right after Chavez died. So you have a dynamic that is very interesting. You have evidence of why the policy didn't work, but the guy that promoted it died with such a passionate following that it kind of makes people forget that it's the policy and not the person. So what I mean is, like, Maduro takes power, he wins elections, of course, with a strong economic power that gives him a tremendous advantage. Still, despite the fall of oil prices, he still controls a substantial amount of money compared to the opposition. So he wins the election, and then, of course, everything gets worse and worse and worse. Now, people don't really want a change of model necessarily. It's not so clear. But what they want is someone to blame, and that is Maduro. We don't really need a change of model if you know how to sell it, if you're a socialist, for example. But they really need someone to blame, and he's doing the role very well in terms of oppression and repression and controlling the economy in every aspect possible to see if he can stop the decaying aspect of it, but it's simply not how it works. So it is a total disaster. He's desperately looking for what to control to see if it works, but as we know in economics, like controlling prices and wages and banking sector, that ends up just making it worse. So now we're at that point in which everything is controlled, so there's no incentive to do basically anything productive, and people are just desperate. That's why you have the migration crisis as well, because the state of affairs there is ridiculous.
Okay, so you talked a lot about the political and the economic aspects of this shit show, you might say. But how about the cultural aspects? So where do you see changes in the culture and in the mind of the citizens of Venezuela?
There is a very, very interesting question, because not even, of course, there is a primacy towards solving the economic issue here. But the cultural aspect of it, the decaying culture of Venezuela is huge. We have an impoverished population that has no way of getting resources that people take for granted. So if you don't have enough food, for instance, in developing years of your childhood, you have limitations to your cognitive capacities. And what if that is the case for millions of people? And not only that, they are exposed to extremely violent environments. So you have something that the consequences of this movement, the level of destruction is not only monetary based. You will see a tremendous problem to solve in terms of how to deal with the people who are going through such a difficult case that their mindset, their capabilities are affected and thwarted because of it. And then you, of course, have to take into consideration the remnants, if change happens, of the violent groups that are associated with Cartel de los Soles, which is the drug organizing, the people in the government, they traffic drugs, and that is known. So, okay, let's say they're not in power anymore. They're still with incentive to operate in Venezuela. So you have to deal with future guerrillas probably, and that may create a movement that supports them in a way, much like we saw in Colombia in the 70s and 80s. So you have a tension that is not clearly visible at the moment, but it will affect cultural relationships and the identity of Venezuelans in the future.
Okay, and how do you think can this situation be changed? How do you think it can be improved? And what different approaches are there?
Okay, I wouldn't say I have a specific solution for the cultural aspect of it, but the economic solutions are, I guess, they are fairly straightforward. You just have to control the monetization of deficit. You just have to have a fiscal policy that is, let's say, responsible. That is like how to control inflation, and it's a matter of just credibility and the right policy. And that should take effect relatively fast, maybe 2 years, maybe 3, depending on the credibility and the measures that you're taking. And controls, as soon as you take the controls away and you establish a credible system in which people can interact with each other economically without the risk of getting their property taken by the government, which is very real at the moment, then you should see a boom of economic activity, which compared to what we have now is, of course, infinitely better. So the situation would get substantially better relatively fast. Now, in the cultural aspect, I guess we would have to see the development of this specific point, because it's not very clear the extent of destruction that these guys have created. It's not, we don't have statistics about GDP, for instance, since for like 5 years or more. So if you don't have those basic statistics, imagine the information that you're lacking in terms of measuring the impact of those actions and policies that they have done so far. So it's a matter of understanding exactly what we're dealing with, which is not clear, and then after identifying it, then tackle it. But I wouldn't say I have the answer for it at the moment. It's very complicated.
Yes. And do you think that help from from the outside, or from other countries, from people who want to support the people in Venezuela, do you think that they can do positive changes, or do you think that external intervention might be negative?
I do believe external intervention would be a desirable thing for most people. Anything is preferable than the status quo that we're living at right now. So at some point, Donald Trump, the president of the United States, was considering, he said, I acknowledge the responsibility of the action, but he said, we're considering direct military action in Venezuela. And you would think that people would be appalled because of such declarations, but actually the reaction was relatively mixed. So you see the desperation. And of course, there is an argument for how effective it would be and the consequences of such actions in terms of institutions and ongoing conflicts. We could see Iraq, that would be not necessarily the same, but it's a cautionary tale of what can happen if such interventions are not done very, very well, which is, morally speaking, a great thing to say, because we're talking literally about invasions, kind of, in this case, and that conveys the idea of killing people. So it's very hard. It's a very hard and complicated thing to sell. But of course, international intervention doesn't have to be only military. In nature, it can be pressures through sanctions, which are happening at the moment. And of course, we have learned our lessons with the sanctions we applied to Cuba. It's like very specific. It's not a sanction in terms of destroying everything, like a chemotherapy of political nature. Like to destroy the cancer that is this government, we're gonna destroy everything. No, they're very specific and they're very targeted targets. I don't know, that sounds that is redundant, but they target specific members of government, and they attack their financials and their possibility of doing businesses abroad. That is certainly positive. That makes the costs of operating higher, and that is an advantage eventually. Now, how definitive it would be, like, I don't think an international action can overthrow the government, but it certainly helps, and it makes for them being repressive an activity that costs more and more and more. The more sanctions and more pressure, internationally speaking, there is.
Of course, we're here at the World Crypto Network, and we talk a lot about Bitcoin. And many people who are advocates of Bitcoin say that this might be one possible solution for a country like Venezuela or Zimbabwe or Greece or any other country that suffers from, well, economic warfare. So where do you say the current adoption of Bitcoin in Venezuela, and do you think that it might help?
It definitely helps, and it is much to my surprise, I must say, because when you think of Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining in the current state, you expect like this amazing computer system and GPUs and like a lot of energy. So you would say, oh, but how do Venezuelans have access, or most of them have access to such technologies that are relatively expensive? And I don't really know the specifics of how they do it, but it is there and it's growing. So it is a very legitimate way of evading inflation imposed by the government, of course, because they control the monetary supply. So like that is a growing activity, very legitimate. I would definitely support it. And if you can, by any means, do it. But there is a risk with that, with such activities in Venezuela, at the very least, in which the government has imprisoned people for doing exactly that. I would say if you really, like, you have to protect yourself if you're doing so in Venezuela. You have to know what VPN is, or how to mask your activity and your energy consumption, because there are definitely spikes that they control. They control the electricity companies, of course, so they have access to that information, because they make you know how much electricity you're consuming. So that is definitely a red flag that they can use to check. But if you know how to change that, then maybe we can do something about it.
Would be wonderful. So Ramon, thank you very much for sharing all these insights, and I wish we could talk for hours longer.
I wish as well.
But we have to get back to the conference to get even more educated about this stuff. So I thank you very much, and really from the bottom of my heart, I wish you and your family and your loved ones, and of course all the people in Venezuela, only the best. And stay strong, and let's hope that this financial war will end really soon, and that Venezuela will become a prosperous country again.
I hope so. It will. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ramon, and see you on the next show. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening.